I'm like the typical guy. I've gone into the Walmarts and the Dave's Sporting Goods of the world, and I've picked up my calls and I've read my field and streams, but I have this gut feeling I'm probably blowing it too much, not setting up in the right area. What's some general things you recommend as far as how to and where?
Well, the first thing you need to remember whenever you're using calls is it won't do any good unless there's some deer there. So in a lot of places where the deer population is thicker than it is here in Maine, people use calls more often, I think. But it'll work anywhere in the country. And in Maine, what I tell everyone is use your call. If you don't have any luck, in an hour or two, move on to a different spot, because again, if the deer can't hear you, he's not going to respond to it.
During that hour or two, do you start out and like you bleat like for 2 or 3 minutes, or what's your usual sequence? I mean, should I be talking for like 10 minutes with a call and then I'm quiet for the rest of that hour? What do you mean you should move on in an hour? How long are you actually doing your calls?
What I normally do, I'll give you a demonstration. I use my fawn bleat more than I use my grunt tube, especially the first couple of weeks. And what I do with my fawn bleat is they pull you a little.
I noticed you adjusted it so it's out pretty much to the end.
Yeah, well, fairly close to the end.
Okay.
This one here doesn't have the lines on it like the 5 and 1, but any of them have an adjustable reed. And when you have it out towards the end, that's your fawn bleat, and then when you get down towards the bottom, that's your grunt. With the fawn bleat, what I like to do is, after I get my tube out and extended, I use my hand as well, and I'd blow it something like this. And I'd blow it probably 2 or 3 times, and then I might wait 15 minutes and then do it again.
Okay.
And when you do your fawn bleat, you may call in some other fawns. You might call in a doe. It sounds like a fawn in distress.
Right.
But I've called in bucks with the fawn bleat just because they're looking for does, in November. And so if they hear, more often than not, the fawns are going to be with their mother. And so if they hear that fawn bleat, they're thinking the doe's in the area as well. So you can call in anything with the fawn bleat.
Now, as they're coming in, I've seen this on other shows as well. Sometimes I notice that they'll switch from that and they'll go to the buck grunt, like a tending grunt, I think is what they call it, if that's correct. Do you do that, or when do you do that if you do that?
When I use my grunt tube, and again, I don't use my grunt tube as much the first couple of weeks of the season as I do the last 2 weeks. And everybody has their own preference, and I'm not saying my way is the only way, but the first couple of weeks I usually have better luck with the fawn bleat. And then when I'm using my grunt tube, like if I've already seen a buck, or if I know that there's a buck in the area, one thing you want to remember with your grunt tube is the lower you adjust that reed, the bigger the buck sounds,
deeper the grunt?
and the deeper the grunt. So when you've got it all the way down to the bottom,
That's where I put mine.
yeah, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but you just want to remember that if say a 6-point buck that weighs 140 or 50 pounds, if he hears that, it's going to make him nervous, especially if he's already, been in a scrap a few times. I usually, when I start, I have my grunt adjusted up a little bit so it sounds not quite so aggressive. Again, if you've got it all the way down to the bottom, you might call in the dominant buck in the area, but you're probably going to scare off the other deer just because they don't want to mess with that dominant buck. If all you want is a dominant buck, then go ahead and use that. But I've had better luck calling in more bucks if I have it adjusted up a little bit so it sounds a little bit less aggressive and not like it's something that's going to scare those other bucks.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the other tips I wanted to pick up from you, it would seem to make common sense to me that when you're doing this, they're going to want to circle you and come in with the wind in their face. So how do you set up your stands, because your scent's blowing down on them, yet they're coming into the grunt?
You want to put yourself, usually if I'm not much of a stand hunter myself, I'm usually moving through the woods. I still hunt and stalk, and then if there's snow, I track. But you can use these tubes in any situation. I use them as I'm still hunting and as I'm tracking. But if I was going to be on stand, which I can usually stay in a place maybe a half an hour, like to eat my sandwich or whatever. Try to find a knoll or some place where you're in an elevated spot where you can be looking down on those other deer and maybe be up above, you know, where they're going to smell you. I'm not a tree stand hunter, but guys that are in tree stands, one of the reasons why they like to be up in that elevated spot is the deer are less apt to smell them.
I've got a tree lounge and I like to go up there. Now, is that going to be as effective if they're hearing it up? I mean, is it any less natural if you're 25 feet up a tree?
I don't know about 25 feet because I never go up that high, but if you're in a normal, like most ladder stands that are like 10 feet off the ground, those deer, especially in Maine, we don't have flat terrain. Usually it's, even if it's not mountainous, it's hilly and, you know, there's little knolls and knobs.
Right, exactly.
That deer, I don't think is going to know the difference between if you're 10 feet up, you know, or right on the ground. Whether you're using a ground blind or a ladder stand, I just put myself in a spot when I'm going to use the call to try to use the wind in your favor as much as possible. But again, in November in Maine, the wind's blowing most of the time in one direction or another.
Exactly.
If you worry about the wind, you'd never hunt.
Yeah,
you know?
okay,
So
that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering about that.
Put yourself in the best situation that you can and then don't worry about it. As far as the deer circling you, they will try to do that, but what you've got to do is put yourself in a spot where you can maybe see like 180 degrees when you're calling and have the wind in your favor, and just put yourself in the best possible situation. You're not going to put yourself in a perfect situation.
Right.
You just put yourself in the best possible.
Well, I know a lot of us guys, like I hunt with my brother often, we hunt with a buddy, we have our favorite hunting partner. Does it differ? Would you like go 10 or 15 yards away from me if you were going to try and call for me? Let's say I've tagged out and I'm with my brother hunting and, you know, I want to help him and I'm trying rattling and grunting and calling. Should I do that a little bit away from where the shooter is?
I don't. Normally when I'm guiding my clients, when I call, I sit right beside them. I'm usually in a ground blind. We don't do much with tree stands in November. And what I try to do is find a place in an elevated area where we can see like 180 degrees, and I'll call so that they can just be paying attention to, you know, the direction that we're hoping the deer comes from.
Right.
Another thing that I'd give for a tip is a lot of people, when they blow too much and they blow too long. Like with a buck grunt,
Right.
you don't want to get on this thing and go, because that's not what they normally sound
just
like.
a
It's
short.
a short burst. It's more like this.
Do they do 2 or 3 or 4 in a row?
I usually do 2 or 3.
Okay.
I usually do 2 or 3 short bursts.
Yep.
That's how I do it.
And then you wait 10 or 15 minutes?
15 minutes,
Okay.
then maybe I might call in a spot for an hour, and if I don't have any luck there, then I might move on, you know, a few hundred yards in the woods and sit down and try it again.
Sounds great. I know a lot more. I appreciate it.